As tensions mount and alliances shift, we'll explore the implications of these negotiations on global power structures, the legitimacy of peace efforts, and Ukraine's role in shaping its destiny. Will the US and Russia find common ground, or is this a new chapter of discord in international relations? Now, we focus on the delving dynamics of the Russia-Ukraine war with two esteemed experts, Dr. Ihsan Al-Khatib, the political science professor from Kentucky, and Dr. Meher Nicholas Fursley, the chair of the EU ASEAN Center from Paris. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us and being with us here on Think Tank. We'll start off our critical analysis of these historic developments with Dr. Al-Khatib. Now, how significant are the recent US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia for Ukraine's sovereignty, especially with no Ukrainian representation?
Yes, good evening, everyone. It's important. It's an important signal that Trump is serious about ending the war. This war he ran during the elections on the promise of ending the war. And the first step in negotiating an end to the war is for the US and Russia to have talks. Yes, it is not a good signal for the sovereignty of Ukraine, but the fact is, without US support, without the European support, Ukraine would not have been able to push back. I don't think Trump means it as an insult to the Ukrainians. He sees the war as a disaster for the Ukrainians, a disaster for the Russians, and he thinks it should not continue. He doesn't think that Zelensky is doing a good job leading the country. Now, he exaggerates, Trump exaggerates the popularity, the approval rate of Zelensky is not 4%, it's 57%. But at the same time, during war, usually people rally around the flag, and 57% for a nation at war is not a lot. Doesn't speak a lot about approval of the job that Zelensky is doing. 57% is not good. I don't think that the US is ready to sell Ukrainians, but the opinion of Trump is that the war is not good for neither Ukraine nor Russia.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Fursley, now, with President Trump's potential peace proposal gaining traction, what does that mean for Europe? What risks might Europe face if a deal favors Russia's demands?
Well, I think Europe faces many risks. The biggest one, I would say, the source of all risks, is really policy thinking and ideology. Because in the past 30 years, the national security and foreign policy agenda of America, even during Trump's first term, because when he came for the first time 8 years ago, Trump was not strong enough to change the balance of power inside his own cabinet and on Capitol Hill. So in the past 30 years, the dominant thinking in Washington, D.C. was neoconservatism on the right and liberal hawkishness on the left. So, people like Dick Cheney, George Bush on the right, and people like Tony Blinken or Tony Blair, let's say, on the left. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, in a very radical way, Trump is bringing something very different called neorealism. So it's really a very cold, some people say even brutal, worldview rooted in a radical form of pragmatism. And I agree with Dr. Al-Khatib. So radical pragmatism means, you do what works and you don't care about preaching and moralizing. So we in Europe and the Middle East were used to, people like Tony Blair, George Bush preaching, or Emmanuel Macron talking like a preacher. Trump and his entourage have no time for that. And it's no coincidence. 2 months ago, he picked as his special envoy for Russia and Ukraine a guy named Keith Kellogg, who is an ultra-realist general. So really, that's the kind of people he's surrounded by, Machiavellian, cold-blooded, ultra-rational. For Europe, it's a problem because Europe doesn't want to face the new reality. So what happened in the past, 3-4 days, Europe was stunned by the pronouncements of Trump regarding Russia and Ukraine, and by the meeting in Riyadh 2 days ago. Why were they shocked? And that's very interesting. After all, Trump was elected 4 months ago, and he entered, the White House 5 weeks ago because they did not want to believe. So policymakers in Berlin, London, Paris did not want to take Trump seriously at his words. Their mistake, right? And now he's doing exactly word for word what he's promised, and he's pivoting, and it's a strategic pivot away from Europe. What's interesting is, Trump and his advisors, they perceive Europe as in decline for structural reasons. They perceive that there's a global race or a new Cold War pitting Beijing against Washington, and they think that that new Cold War will be won focusing relentlessly on high-tech energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and that's it.
Yes.
They think that Russia is no longer a superpower, and so they think that Russia, after all, is not a threat to them. It may be a threat to Estonia, Lithuania, or Poland. They couldn't care less. And in that new geoeconomic era, with two big powers, China in the East, America in the West, there are pivot nations, and they view Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Russia as very important pivot nations, and that's why they are building their new policy on that basis.
Yes. Well, Dr. Khatib, we'll focus more on the Ukrainian-Russian war now. In light of Zelensky's rejection of the peace talks without their involvement, how might this affect Ukraine's relationship with Western powers?
I mean, the Europeans are still sticking with Ukraine, the same plan, the same way of dealing with things. The issue is the U.S. support of continuing on the same path. The Europeans are set. They think what they're doing is fine, it's working. Trump thinks it's not working. It's not working. Trump thinks it's not working when you have all these people dying, when you have Ukraine being destroyed, and when you have practically, you look at the size of Russia and the size of Ukraine, and the population of Russia and population of Ukraine, you'll see that Russia can continue the war for 100 years, but there would not be a Ukraine in 100 years. A lot of people are dying, a lot of people are suffering. And for a country that's fighting an existential war, 57% approval for the leader is not a lot, actually. There is no rallying around the flag phenomenon in Ukraine. There is a problem in Ukraine. He thinks that continuing on the same path is insanity. The U.S. is sending billions of dollars, and that this war has to end. And that's reality. I mean, it's not an ideal world. Ideally, that Russia would not be bothering Ukraine, would mind its own business, but this is not an ideal world. The Trump position is that we can't keep doing the same and expecting a different outcome. It's insanity. And if Zelensky doesn't see that his country is being destroyed and his people are dying and there is no end in sight, and he comes to Washington, gets money, and continues doing the same thing, and not a different outcome. There is this dance between the West and Russia. Russia is a huge country. It's the biggest country in the world by geography. It's the number one in nuclear weapons. The United States fears actually the collapse of the Russian Federation. The U.S. is not afraid of Russia. The U.S. is afraid that if Russia collapses, if the government falls, there'll be a huge mess. I mean, all these nuclear weapons will be all over the world, and that's not a happy ending. So the West, the U.S., for pragmatic reasons, is afraid of the fall of the Russian regime. It's not afraid of Russia itself. And I think Zelensky doesn't see that. Zelensky is just a nationalist, is a patriot. He thinks he wants to liberate every inch of his country, which is understandable. But it's not the Western interest it's not an American national interest that every inch of Ukrainian soil be liberated.
Dr. Fazli, now, according to the reports, the peace process discussed by Moscow and Washington entails a ceasefire followed by an election in Ukraine before the ratification of a final peace agreement. Does that mean that a change of Ukrainian leadership is a precondition for peace?
I think it's part of Trump's way of putting pressure on Zelensky, to make a long story short. I think, both figures, alluded to earlier, are extreme. So when Trump says, Zelensky only has 4% approval rating, when Zelensky says, oh no, look at the latest, whatever, Ukrainian Gallup poll, 55% of my people support me. I think both figures are exaggerated. I think, it's somewhere in the middle. I think probably, barely a quarter, which is really not much. A quarter of the people support him because he lost everything he stood for. Once again, the roots of the war. And here Trump is very blunt, brutal, but very sincere. So he said, very sincerely that the previous administration actually pushed Zelensky to provoke Russia, right? So in a way, Trump is giving up, the secret. He's saying that, my predecessors in the White House, they really encouraged and pushed Ukraine to act in an unacceptable way, crossing many red lines, which provoked Russia, the big Russian bear, into war. So to make a long story short, I think that Vladimir Zelensky's government and the European Union, they will have no choice but to accept the result of that high-level American-Russian deal. And I think it's first and foremost an American deal, to be honest. Why? Because we are now, and I'll use the words of Dr. Al-Khatib, he used the word idealism. He's right. The previous US government and the current European government, they pretend to be idealists. They say that they want a rules-based world, whatever that means. Trump has the completely opposite perspective. He's a realist, he's a neo-realist, which is the opposite of idealism. So he says, okay, I don't care about, flowery speeches and rights and wrongs. I want pragmatically to move forward. Mm-hmm. So he's following now something called a sphere of influence policy. Classic sphere of influence. I'm one of the big giants. The other one is China. I'm coming to Russia's turf. I'm coming to Russia's local sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. I'm proposing a deal to the Russians. And that's exactly what he's doing right now in Riyadh, in this cycle of negotiations, which was started 2 days ago by Marco Rubio, is to propose a sphere of influence settlement, telling the Russians, we take into account, we the Americans, the big superpower, we take into account your regional, local, East European powers' desires and wishes, and we are going to find a middle-of-the-road solution. And most likely, it's an open secret, I think, most likely the three breakaway provinces or republics, whatever you want to call them, from eastern Ukraine, plus the Crimean Peninsula, all that together represents roughly 22% of Ukraine's territory. Probably most of that, or all of that, at the end of the day, will be annexed by Russia. That's the future outcome. And honestly, there's nothing Volodymyr Zelensky or Emmanuel Macron or Ursula von der Leyen can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Khatib, now with Europe watching over these developments, is the growing rift between European and American perspectives on Ukraine's future a sign of a broader transatlantic discord?
A giant in the field of international relations, his name is John Mearsheimer, said that this war is the fault of the West. And he's an American, he's at the University of Chicago. And he said, you're telling Russia you want to put NATO on its border. Yeah, that basically Ukraine can join NATO, and you want NATO on the border of Russia, and you expect the Russians not to do anything. That is so illogical in the field of international relations, that you expect a power to expect another power to make this bold move and not have a reaction. Of course, you're going to have a reaction. The Russians are not going to be happy with that. So the West has really hurt the Ukrainians by saying one day they'll be in NATO. So it's not a yes, it's not a no, and that really did not help the Ukrainians at all. So there's a responsibility for the European countries. They created this problem from a realist point of view. Mm-hmm. The other issue is the Europeans. You see, the Europeans are an economic superpower. They have a massive wealth. But they made the decision of not being a military superpower. They made that decision. They have a military industry, but they choose to spend on welfare instead of spending enough on defense. The US has to push them to spend the minimum, 2% of the minimum. They don't want to spend the minimum. The shock of the Ukraine war made them so generous now. They want to spend 2%. Why they're counting on the US? Well, if you count on the US, they can't deal with problems. Every time there is a crisis, they look for the US. Then the US is going to be in the leading position and dictating what will happen. If they want to be independent, if they want to set their own agenda and be their own leader, then they have to build their military capacity. But the problem is, how do you get all of them to be on the same page? They're not all on the same page. Look at Germany. Germany is a very wealthy country. It should have a very powerful military. It doesn't. It made actually the strange, from a part of politics, it made the strange decision to be energy dependent on Russia. If they consider Russia a threat, how could you make yourself energy dependent on your threat? So there is illogic in Europe, and they can't make up their mind because they say, well, the US is dominating us. Okay, well, be militarily able, develop the capacity, but then whenever there is a crisis, they say,
yes.
oh, US. So that they have to make a decision. Do they want to be independent? Then they have to build their capacity.
Dr. Fursley, one final question now. What impact might the US prioritizing its interests over NATO's unity have on the security and stability of Europe, and how can NATO adjust its strategy and security to face these evolving US-Russian relations?
It's a very good question. It's a complicated one. To make a long story short, using that realist framework, America alone spends more than 3 times all other NATO member states' military budgets combined, including Britain and Turkey. So 1 for 3. So clearly, because there are 22 European members of NATO, very naively and wrongly, the Europeans, they believe every member state is equal. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The NATO alliance is not a European alliance. It is not even a transatlantic alliance. It's a fiction. In reality, the NATO alliance is an American alliance. And everything changed in Washington, D.C. 5 weeks ago with the new Trump White House. It will be a different NATO. And eventually, they may hesitate. The bureaucrats like Mark Rutte, the current Secretary General of NATO, he's the former Dutch Prime Minister. He may pretend that he's hesitating, etc. But it's a show. At the end, the NATO bureaucracy, the civil servants and the generals at NATO headquarters in Brussels, they will do what Trumps tell them to do, pure and simple. The problem, there's a core group of countries which may be unhappy about it, very unhappy. And I'm thinking of Lithuania, the border countries, right? The Baltic states. So Lithuania, yes. Estonia, of course, they're very unhappy. They're enraged. The French government, not the French people, the French government of Emmanuel Macron, they're excited, they're enraged, but it's not enough to create a new NATO. So there is no hope to create an
And that's probably one of the reasons why they are pushing for bigger spending for NATO, because they might be losing their biggest spender. Dr. Ihsan Al-Khatib, the political science professor, and Dr. Meher Nicholas Fursley, chair of the EU ASEAN Centre. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights.